In the isolated mountains of Appalachia in McDowell County, Western Virginia, lies a story as revealing as it is disturbing, one that uncovers the dangers of extreme isolation and the consanguineous practices that can mark generations of a family. This is the account of Ezekiel Thornton, a self-proclaimed pastor who, under religion's veil, perpetuated one of the most shocking cases of documented consanguineous union during the 1950s. For decades, the Thornton case remained hidden, protected by geographical isolation and a strict code of silence that hovered over the small rural communities of post-war Western Virginia. It wasn't until 1978, when local authorities finally intervened after complaints from worried neighbors, that the true extent of this family plot began to surface. Born in 1911 on a small rural property outside of Welsh, the largest city in McDowell County, Ezekiel Thornton was the son of miners. He grew up in a community already marked by isolation and marriages between cousins, a relatively common practice in those remote mountains. Historical records indicate that his own parents, Isaac and Martha Thornton, were second-degree cousins, a practice that, while questionable, was not unusual in isolated Appalachian regions during the early 20th century. At 19, after a brief period working in the coal mines that dominated the local economy, Ezekiel claimed to have received a divine call during a high fever caused by pneumonia, which he contracted in the mine's depths. This episode, according to reports from older community members interviewed years later, marked a radical transformation in his personality. The formerly quiet and reserved young miner emerged from his illness with an unusual religious fervor and the conviction that he had been chosen to found his own church, which he named the Church of Purified Redemption. Established in 1935 in a small wooden cabin built on Thornton family lands, the congregation initially consisted only of nearby relatives and some curious neighbors. What few realized, however, was how Ezekiel gradually began to shape his religious interpretations to justify practices that would serve his own interests. He talked about blood purification and preserving the chosen lineage, reported Thomas Jenkins, one of the few community members who attended Thornton's early sermons before walking away, alarmed by their direction. Jenkins stated that Ezekiel preached that God showed him families should remain united not only in spirit but also in flesh to preserve what he called the divine gift granted to his lineage. The 1940s and 1950s were defined by the growing isolation of the Thornton property. Ezekiel built a high fence around his land and actively discouraged contact with outsiders. It was during this period that he took complete control over the lives of his three nieces, daughters of his younger sister, Rebecca, who died in 1947 from complications during the birth of her fourth daughter, who also did not survive. The girls, Mary, born in 1932, Sarah, in 1934, and Ruth, in 1936, were raised under the strict protection of their uncle, utterly isolated from the outside world. Ezekiel assumed the roles of father, teacher, and pastor, controlling every aspect of their lives. County school records show that none of the three attended the local school after their mother's death, with Ezekiel claiming to the rare visiting authorities that he was providing a scripture-based education at home. The true horror began to unfold when Mary turned 18 in 1950. During a ceremony Ezekiel described as a divine union ordered by the Lord, he forced his eldest niece to marry him. The event was held at the small church on the property with only family members present, all under the control and influence of the self-proclaimed pastor. Check it out. If you're already subscribed to this channel, you value stories that reveal the darkest truths of American society and the devastating impacts of extreme isolation on rural communities. You need to sign up now. Our researched work brings to light cases that history tried to bury. 2 years later, in 1952, Ezekiel held a second ceremony, this time marrying Sarah, then 18 years old. The pattern repeated in 1954 when Ruth, the youngest, was also forced to join her uncle in a similar ceremony. Making the case even more disturbing was the fact that officially, none of these marriages was recorded with the county authorities. Ezekiel maintained what he called the Sacred Book of Unions, where he documented his own ceremonies. Amelia Carter, a retired nurse who worked at Welsh Small Hospital during the 1950s and 60s, was among the first people outside the immediate circle to suspect something was wrong. The girls appeared occasionally for medical care, always accompanied by Ezekiel, never alone, Carter reported in a statement to authorities years later. They were extremely shy, avoided eye contact, and showed signs of malnutrition and possible abuse. But at the time, it was very difficult to intervene in the matters of isolated families. The consequences of these consanguineous unions were not slow to manifest. Between 1951 and 1978, 12 births resulted from these unions. Of these, 5 children died before turning 5, presenting severe congenital malformations. Those who survived faced a host of health and development problems that became more evident over the years. We are not just talking about relatives marrying. We are talking about multiple generations of consanguineous marriages culminating in the unions between an uncle and his nieces, who already carried common genes from previous generations, explained Dr. William Harrison, a geneticist who later studied the case for the Western Virginia Health Department in his 1980 report. The descendants of this union had an extremely high coefficient of consanguinity. The children who survived demonstrated conditions typical of high consanguinity: severe cognitive deficits, congenital heart problems, fused fingers, syndactyly, asymmetrical faces, and compromised immune systems. James, the firstborn from the union with Mary, born in 1951, had a severe form of polydactyly, extra fingers on both hands and feet, and a serious intellectual deficit that prevented him from developing language, even in adulthood. Life on the Thornton property followed a rigid pattern established by Ezekiel. The 3 women and their children lived in precarious conditions, working the small plantation that guaranteed the family's subsistence. The isolation was nearly total. The children never attended school, were never vaccinated, and rarely left the property. Ezekiel justified this isolation through his preaching, claiming the outside world was contaminated and that only his family had been chosen to preserve the purity of their lineage. He established a strict set of rules, including collective prayers 4 times a day and severe physical punishments for any questioning of his authority. The situation remained this way for almost 3 decades, protected by isolation and the reluctance of local authorities to interfere in family affairs, a common attitude in the rural areas of Western Virginia at that time. It wasn't until 1978, when one of the children, Daniel, born in 1962 from the union with Sarah, managed to escape the property and seek help, that the case finally began to be investigated. Daniel, then 16, reached the city of Welsh after walking almost 20 kilometers through the mountains. Despite his impaired development and communication difficulties, he conveyed sufficient details about the situation on the Thornton property to justify an investigation. Sheriff Robert Anderson, who led the first official visit to the property in October 1978, described the scene as something out of another century. He reported, "The property was in deplorable conditions with deteriorated structures and evident signs of extreme poverty. The children, many clearly presenting physical deformities, seemed scared and malnourished." Ezekiel, then 67, still maintained absolute control overall through what I can only describe as a combination of religious and physical intimidation. The Thornton case presented a significant dilemma for local authorities. In 1978, Western Virginia had no specific laws to directly address the issue of consanguineous marriages within isolated religious contexts. Furthermore, complicating matters was that none of the marriages had been officially registered, existing only in the ceremonies led by Ezekiel himself. However, evidence of child neglect, forced isolation, and inadequate living conditions was sufficient for the McDowell County Social Services Department to obtain a court order to remove the children from the property. In total, 7 children, aged 3 to 16, were removed from the site and placed under state care. The psychological impact on the 3 women, Mary, Sarah, and Ruth, was immediately evident to the professionals who attended them after the intervention. Decades of isolation and indoctrination had created a deep conditioning that made it extremely difficult for them to conceive of a different life. Dr. Leonard Montgomery, a psychologist who worked with the 3, documented in his report, "We observed a classic case of what we today call Stockholm Syndrome, combined with elements of extreme religious indoctrination. Patients show profoundly rooted emotional dependence on their captor, an inability to recognize the abusive nature of the situation, and strong initial resistance to any external intervention." The 3 sisters initially resisted being separated from Ezekiel, a common reaction in victims of long-term abuse and psychological manipulation. They genuinely believed they were fulfilling a divine destiny, Dr. Montgomery explained. A long therapeutic process was needed to begin to help them recognize the abusive and exploitative nature of their situation. Detailed medical examinations performed on the children revealed the true impact of extreme consanguinity. Dr. Robert Collins, a pediatrician who evaluated the 7 minors, documented that in addition to evident physical malformations, we observed a series of less visible but equally debilitating conditions: severe immunological deficiencies, heart problems, delayed neurological development, and a predisposition to conditions such as epilepsy. The genetics behind the Thornton case became the object of scientific study in the following years. The consanguinity coefficient, a measure that indicates the probability of an individual inheriting identical genes from both parents in the Thornton children, was exceptionally high, Dr. Harrison explained. Even in cases of marriages between first-degree cousins, the coefficient is approximately 6%. In the Thornton children, we estimate values between 20% and 25%. This high degree of genetic kinship resulted in the expression of multiple deleterious recessive genes, mutations that would normally remain inactive but manifest when inherited from both parents. It's as if we were seeing the materialization of all the genetic burden accumulated by generations in this family. If you are following the story, I ask you to leave the phrase in the comments: "True darkness lies in the isolation that allows these horrors to remain hidden." Your voice is important so that cases like this are not forgotten and that we can continue to bring to light stories that society needs to know. The trial of Ezekiel Thornton began in March 1979, attracting regional media attention, though it was largely shielded from national scrutiny due to its sensitive nature and concerns for the victim's privacy. Thornton, then 68, remained irreducible in his belief that he was fulfilling a divine mission. At a particularly disturbing moment during the trial, he stated, "What they call wrong, I call sacred. What they call disease, I call the mark of divine choice." Psychology experts who evaluated him diagnosed a combination of delusional disorder with elements of narcissistic personality disorder. Dr. Calvin Matthews, a forensic psychiatrist who examined Thornton, concluded, the defendant developed an elaborate, delusional system centered on distorted religious beliefs which conveniently legitimized his desires and behaviors. There is no evidence that he does not understand the nature or consequences of his actions. He simply justifies them through his own belief system. The verdict arrived in June 1979. Ezekiel Thornton was found guilty on multiple counts, including child neglect, forced isolation, and exploitation of vulnerable dependents. Although charges related to the consanguineous unions were complicated by the lack of official records, medical evidence and testimonies were enough to secure a 25-year sentence. Thornton died in state custody in 1984 at the age of 73, never having expressed remorse for his actions. For the nieces and their children, the path to recovery was long and complex. Mary, Sarah, and Ruth went through extensive psychological rehabilitation programs, initially housed together in a specialized facility for prolonged abuse victims. The 3 sisters gradually began to rebuild their identities and autonomy. Dr. Peter Lawrence, director of the rehab program, noted, the challenge was not only to treat the trauma of abuse, but to literally teach these women to live in the modern world. Things we take for granted, such as shopping, using phones, or even making independent decisions, were completely foreign to them after decades of isolation and control. Gradually, the 3 began to show signs of recovery. Ruth, the youngest, adapted more easily and eventually managed to obtain a basic education, completing the equivalent of elementary school in a special program at age 47. Mary and Sarah, who had spent more time under Ezekiel's control, made more limited but still significant progress. For the children, the challenges were even more complex. The health problems caused by extreme consanguinity required constant medical care. Furthermore, many had significant cognitive developmental delays, requiring specialized educational programs. James, the eldest son, spent most of his adulthood in a specialized care institution, never developing full independence due to the severity of his cognitive deficits. Elizabeth, daughter of Ruth born in 1972, partially overcame her limitations, eventually completing high school in an adapted program and working in a protected environment. Daniel, whose escape enabled the intervention that ended Ezekiel's regime, became a symbol of resilience. Despite his learning difficulties and chronic health problems, he adapted to life outside the Thornton property. At age 25, he gave a rare interview to a local newspaper, stating, "I don't always understand the world outside, but I know it's better than what we lived. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that place, about those voices saying we were special when we were actually being destroyed." The genetic impact of consanguinity continued to manifest in the following generations. Even the children who went on to have their own children with unrelated partners still transmitted a compromised genetic burden. Dr. Jessica Reynolds, a geneticist who followed the case long-term, explained, "Even after the interruption of consanguineous marriages, deleterious mutations remain in the family's genetic pool. We observed a significantly higher incidence of conditions such as autoimmune diseases, cardiovascular problems, and certain types of cognitive deficits in descendants, even when inbreeding is no longer present." The Thornton case also had a significant impact on public policies in Western Virginia. In 1981, the state revised its child protection laws, establishing stricter protocols for investigating isolated families and closed communities. Additionally, specific training programs were created for health, education, and social services professionals to identify signs of possible abuse in contexts of extreme isolation. Sociologist Dr. Martin Reynolds, who has studied isolated communities in Appalachia for 3 decades, noted, "The Thornton case is an extreme example but is not completely isolated. The mountainous regions of Appalachia have historically housed communities with high levels of geographical and social isolation, creating conditions conducive to practices like close relative marriage." What makes Thornton exceptional is the element of distorted religious control and the extent of consanguinity over multiple generations. Subsequent studies identified several other isolated communities in the region with high rates of consanguineous marriage, though none as extreme as the Thornton case. These studies led to public health initiatives focused on these areas, including educational programs on the genetic risks of consanguinity and greater access to health services. The Thornton property, the stage of this dark history, remained abandoned for years after the authorities' intervention. In 1992, it was finally demolished by county order, declared unfit for habitation and a monument to a tragedy that the community would rather forget. Where the Church of Purified Redemption once stood, a small woods was planted as a silent memorial to the victims. A discreet plaque installed in 2005, at the initiative of some survivors and professionals who worked on the case, bears the inscription, "In memory of those whose voices were silenced. May their story teach us vigilance against the isolation that allows suffering to remain hidden." The medical, psychological, and genetic records of the Thornton case became important educational tools for health, social assistance, and law enforcement. Medical courses in regional universities often use it to study the biological effects of extreme consanguinity, and social worker training programs analyze it as an example of the dangers of social and religious isolation. Mary Thornton passed away in 1998 at age 66 from heart complications, a common health problem in her family. Sarah lived until 2010, reaching 76 years despite several chronic health issues. Ruth, the youngest sister, was reportedly still alive in 2015, residing in an assisted community specializing in long-term trauma survivors. Of the 7 children rescued in 1978, 4 had died by 2015, all before reaching 50. The 3 survivors continued to face various health challenges requiring constant medical care. Daniel, whose courage had exposed the case, died in 2012 at age 50 due to congenital heart complications, a dark reminder of the genetic legacy he carried. Elizabeth, who had achieved the greatest degree of independence among the children, became a discreet advocate for awareness about the dangers of consanguinity. She occasionally participated in lectures at medical schools and social assistance programs, sharing her experience. In one of these rare public appearances in 2008, she said, "I carry the marks of this story in my genes, my body, and my mind. Each day is a fight against the legacy that was imposed on me before I was born. I talk about it not because it is easy, but because silence allows stories like mine to continue to happen." Dr. William Harrison, who had studied the case from a genetic point of view, published an extensive longitudinal study in 2005 on the effects of consanguinity observed in the Thornton family. His conclusions were alarming. The increase in homozygosity resulted in an unprecedented expression of deleterious recessive characteristics. We observed not only evident physical malformations but also a dramatically increased susceptibility to various conditions, autoimmune diseases, metabolic failures, a predisposition to certain cancers, and a significant reduction in life expectancy. This genetic study became a reference in medical literature on consanguinity. From a sociological perspective, the case also generated important reflections on how isolated communities can develop and normalize harmful practices. Dr. Angela Morrison, an anthropologist who has studied isolated rural communities, noted, "The Thornton case illustrates how extreme isolation combined with unqualified religious authority can create environments where clearly harmful practices are normalized. The lack of exposure to broader social norms and the absence of external verification mechanisms allowed this situation to persist for decades." The legacy of the Thornton case in the local culture is complex. On one hand, there is an understandable reluctance to openly discuss such a disturbing episode. On the other, the case served as a catalyst for significant changes in how isolated communities are monitored and how social services operate in the region. Sheriff Anderson, who led the initial intervention, reflected years later, "Before the Thornton case, there was a widespread attitude of non-interference in how families lived, especially in remote areas. This case showed us that extreme isolation can hide terrible abuse and that we have a collective responsibility to ensure the well-being of all community members, especially the most vulnerable." Today, the history of the Thornton family serves as a dark reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation, religious manipulation, and the devastating effects of prolonged consanguinity. It is also a testimony to human resilience, to the courage of a young man who, despite all the limitations imposed upon him, found the strength to seek help and end generations of abuse. If you watched this far, it is because this story resonated with you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here, so I can get to know you and see who truly appreciates the stories here on the channel." If this report has touched you in any way, be sure to like this video and share it. Stories like this need to be told so that we can learn from past mistakes and remain vigilant against the isolation that allows such horrors to remain hidden. Subscribe to the channel to learn about more historical cases that reveal truths society often prefers to ignore.